Thank you, and welcome to the continuation of the series that we have been having, for the last 6 to 9 months. And the presentation by our graduates in the Program Evaluation and Quality Assurance uh, Certificate Program in Program Evaluation. We have a great sequence today, and you will be hearing from some wonderful presentations from New Jersey, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. My name is Terry Donovan. I work for the Program Evaluation and Quality Assurance Technical Assistance Center, quite a mouthful, at the University of Wisconsin Stout. And I'm joined today by a number of individuals who will introduce themselves. One, Aaron Nierenhausen, my colleague there, who is going to be moderating the question and answer period. So you will literally see Aaron in about an hour or so. Couple of housekeeping pieces, and then I will introduce Dr. Kate Anderson. This session qualifies for CRC credit. You will receive an evaluation for this webinar tomorrow and complete the evaluation. That's very helpful for us to understand how it was received. At the end of the evaluation form, there will be a place for you to put your name and an email address, and you will get your CRC almost instantaneously, the process that we've worked out. So that's if you'd like a CRC credit. If you would like to watch the closed captions, on your menu bar, you see a little box that says CC for closed captions. Click on that, and the captions will appear at the bottom of the screen. A couple of other pieces, as I had mentioned earlier, Aaron is moderating the question and answer. If you have a question for any of our presenters, we will do the questions after all the presentations. So if you have a question, please put that in the Q&A box. If you're having technical issues, if you have other questions, comments that you might want to make based on what you hear in a presentation, please put that in chat. And just a comment in chat, double check. Sometimes when chat comes up in Zoom, it says just to presenters. If you'd like it to only come to the presenters, that's fine. But if you'd like to share with everybody that's participating and attending, you want to make sure that it says panelists and attendees. And in the chat, Aaron will be putting a link to all the PowerPoint slides that are being shown this morning. I think that about covers it. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Kate Anderson.
Thank you very much, Terry. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. Again, my name is Kate Anderson, and I work with the University of Wisconsin Stout. It has truly been a pleasure to serve as project director with the Vocational Rehabilitation Technical Assistance Center on Program Evaluation and Quality Assurance over these past several years. Our center is funded by the Rehabilitation Services Administration to work in collaboration and partnership with our colleagues in the state vocational rehabilitation agencies to build capacity again around program evaluation and quality assurance. Our program consists of online coursework and also the design and completion of a capstone project, which is an evaluation that's designed by our PEQA participants in the state agencies for implementation in their state agency and in partnership with capstone research mentors. To date, we've worked with 37 of the 78 state VR programs, which has truly been a pleasure. I'd like to take a moment to thank our colleagues at the Rehabilitation Services Administration for their ongoing support of PEQA. It's truly been wonderful working with our colleagues at RSA on this project as well. Certainly thank you to our colleagues in the state VR agencies. We couldn't be doing this without you. And also I'd like to take a moment to thank the staff, project staff and professionals at Stout Voc Rehab Institute, CSAVR, Michigan State University, University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as our knowledgeable cadre of capstone mentors and PEQA coursework coaches. Collectively, we've really designed and implemented a fantastic team working together to accomplish our goals. I would also like to take a moment to congratulate our panelists today. Today, their presentations really represent the culmination of work and excellence that they've put into this project. And as of today, they are officially graduates of PEQA. So please join me in congratulating them. Today, you will be hearing from Kevin Harris from New Jersey, Carla Eckhoff, Carrie Marsh and John Yang from Minnesota, and Danielle Russell from Wisconsin. And at this point, I would like to turn the microphone over to Kevin to begin our presentations.
Thank you, Kate. I'm going to hit share screen, try and pull up my PowerPoint. Okay, and I'm ready. Thank you, Dr. Anderson, for that introduction. I recall us both being on that tiny plane flying from Portland to Newark a year and a half ago after the PEQA conference, a 1 hour flight that took about 5 because of all the delays. So anyway, when I began the PEQA program back in the fall of 2018, the agency was in the process of transitioning to a new case management system, and the plan was to develop what I would describe as a pilot dashboard for the capstone project. Well, due to a variety of factors, including delays in this transition, the scope of this project had to be reduced. And actually, in fact, this long-awaited new case management system is finally going to go into effect later this year. So I guess timing is everything. So why a dashboard? Well, dashboards can be an effective tool to monitor outcomes and identify trends and outliers. We want our clients to have equal access to services, and a dashboard can show us how to prevent discrepancies in our service provision. A dashboard can give us the tools needed to maximize outcomes, identify strengths and weaknesses, and ideally help level the playing field for our consumers. We seek to develop a dashboard that will measure outcomes in various RSA and WIOA performance measures and show data breakdowns by counselors, supervisors, and field offices, with the goal of providing managers and supervisors the tools they need to make data-driven decisions. The study looked at the following evaluation questions. What types of employment outcomes are our clients obtaining? How do outcomes compare between white and non-white consumers? How do these outcomes compare between male and female clients? Where and why are we losing consumers pre-plan and post-plan? And finally, how do the 3 field offices compare in terms of outcomes? The sample size for this study was 565 consumers. We utilized existing data from the RSA 911, specifically the second quarter of 2019, which covered 565 closures for the prior 18 months. These exit data elements are taken from the RSA 911 case service report. The focus of the research was narrowed down to looking at exit type, exit reason, and employment outcomes for the sample's 565 consumers. And I was also able to use tables developed by Purvi Sivak and Dr. Todd Honeycutt of Mathematica to assist with data analysis. So how did we do? Well, 53% of the sample size exited after an IPE without an employment outcome. And as the slide indicates, there was an 8-point gap between non-white and white consumers exiting prior to employment. The data also showed a higher percentage of women than men with this outcome. Let's look at how we did in terms of clients achieving competitive integrated employment. 44% of our sample size exited in employment. There was a 9-point gap between white and non-white consumers exiting with this outcome, and a 10-point gap between men and women exiting in employment, as indicated by the slide. This slide shows the leading reasons for those who closed after an IPE but prior to employment. 22% of our sample, or 122 clients, exited because they didn't really want to work with us anymore, followed by 17%, or 96, that we could not locate or contact. And we had 64 clients, or 11%, that closed for all other reasons. The study also found differences among the regional offices. The Southern Regional Office in Cherry Hill had the highest percentage of employment closures at 50%. At 63%, the Central Office in Freehold had the largest percentage of clients closing after an IPE, but prior to employment. And while the Southern and Central offices showed higher percentages of men than women closing in employment, the Northern Office in Newark had an equal percentage of men and women closing in employment. So what did we learn from this research? Well, as I already indicated, we need to reduce the racial and gender gap for those that hit competitive integrated employment. We have too many consumers closing after an IPE prior to employment, and we're losing too many due to a lack of interest in receiving services. Looking ahead, well, this study basically served as a pilot for creating a dashboard. In the short term, identifying where and why we are losing clients, the racial and gender gaps, and the differences observed among the regional offices will help us focus our efforts on what we can do to retain more of these clients. Further investigation is needed to determine what else we might be able to do to keep the consumer engaged, especially among those who are no longer interested in receiving our services. It also showed in glaring detail the need to close the racial and gender gap for those achieving employment. We need to do more research and outcome by race, providing a detailed breakdown of the non-white category. My original intent had been to do so, but I had to narrow that focus down in order to get this done. We also need to examine factors such as consumer engagement, time and status, and frequency of counselor consumer contact. As we transition to a new case management system, we will work with staff to develop a dashboard to track key performance measures. We are mindful of the need to develop a user-friendly tool. So all studies have limitations, and this one, of course, is no exception. As already indicated, these findings were limited to 1/4 of data, and the scope of this study was reduced due to time constraints and technology limitations that would have helped facilitate data analysis in a broader range of areas originally intended for this project. And finally, in keeping with the tradition of all the great award shows, I would like to thank Dr. Kate Anderson, Dr. Sue Pye, and Terry Donovan, among others, for the opportunity to take part in the PEQA program. Thank you, Justin Sullivan, for patiently answering all my questions regarding assignment clarification. Thank you, Christine Johnson, for your coaching and laughing at all my quips. And finally, a special thanks to my capstone advisor, Dr. Todd Honeycutt, who very patiently guided me through the project, and especially for walking me through the nightmare of creating pivot tables, which was way more than he bargained for when he agreed to be my advisor and mentor on the study back when we first met in Oklahoma City in 2018. I will now turn this over to Carla Eckhoff, Carrie Marsh, and John Yang from the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I really liked your presentation. It really resonates with some of the questions and experiences that we have here in Minnesota. Greetings to everyone, program evaluation fans across the country. I'm really excited to be here today to share our work around repeat customers, Minnesota participants who return for multiple series of case sequences. My name is Carrie Marsh, and as Kevin said, Carla Eckhoff and John Yang are here today. We're from Minnesota VRS General, and we're very grateful to have been a part of the PEQA program. It's such a special opportunity to take the time to really learn and practice program evaluation. Special thanks to Gina and Sue, our advisors, whose insights were very valuable as we were going through the project. We chose this project. We heard from a manager that they were concerned about the infrequent occurrence of, but a large impact of a participant who would come back, say, 8 times for return for services. And we were interested in that because very little was known about how often that happened, and if there were any specific characteristics that might be common to that situation. So we thought we would learn more about it after talking and finding out that, yes, this happened occasionally across different teams. And as we thought about it more, we weren't sure how to think about return for services. Was it a good thing that people were coming back because they said, these services are great, they're helping me a lot and I want more of them? Or was it something in the services that wasn't meeting their needs and they had to come back multiple times? And that was sort of the basis for our study. As we began to clarify the purpose of our study, we focused on 2 main goals. The first was to learn more about the population of individuals who return for services with high frequency. And then the second goal was to learn about the success rate of those participants. And when I say success, we define success as leaving the program with employment, so exit with competitive integrated employment. And our goal of the project was to take what we learned from our analysis and share it with our VRS leadership so that they could determine whether a policy change or possibly staff training was needed. So we've attempted to answer the following 3 questions. Who are the participants with multiple sequences? Are participants with multiple sequences more likely to have a specific primary disability type? Do higher sequence cases spend more time enrolled in VR than early sequences? People who have been in the program once or twice, or maybe 3 times. And then finally, what employment outcomes do participants with multiple sequences have? Again, focusing on the short-term employment outcomes. To go a little bit off script, I just want to share that we had lots more questions that we talked about as we went through this project. There were many instances where we said, well, what about this or what about this? And it was a very big component of our project is to ask a lot of different questions and then finally kind of narrow it down to the 3 that you see here. In Minnesota, we have a case management system called Workforce One. It was created through a partnership between our Minnesota Department of Human Services and the agency that we are in, the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. It's a web-based system and is used by 2,000 state, city, county, and nonprofit workforce employment and training providers. And it contains service information for over 100,000 workforce program participants. We extracted the data from Workforce One using SQL and did the bulk of the analysis in Excel. We focused on a recent cohort of program year 2018 adult participants, around 7,000. We wanted to choose a recent cohort so it accurately reflected our current demographic makeup. and current economy. And we wanted to choose adults only so that there was more opportunity for them to return for multiple services. Choosing individuals and youth under age 25, we've realized that there wasn't really, that would skew it too much towards the low sequence. And we defined high sequence as participants who had an employment plan and exited 4 or more times. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Carla.
Carla, you are on mute.
I'm talking away. So thank you, Carrie. And I did also want to thank the PEQA group, the PEQA team for this opportunity and for help along the way. And now I'll jump into the demographics that we show here. So this graph gives you an overview of the cohort. Carrie mentioned that there were 7,090 participants. The sequence number is on the x-axis and the number of participants in that sequence is on the x-axis. Over half of the individuals were in their first sequence, and the numbers get quite small with the larger sequence numbers. There were only 5 participants in their 9th return to VRS services. There were none currently in their 10th sequence, and only 1 person in their 11th sequence. Because of the numbers were so small, we chose to group individuals in their 4th or higher sequence while comparing to individuals in lower sequences. If you look at the totals at the bottom of this table, you'll see that overall 89% of participants were in either their 1st, 2nd, or 3rd sequence, and 11% were in their 4th or higher sequence. When we break these down by disability type, the one notable statistic is the incidence of individuals with hearing impairment in a higher sequence. There were 17% of individuals with hearing impairment who were in a higher sequence. During this analysis, we were able to pull out some of what the population looks like. A next step would be to look more closely at why we're seeing this happen in this group. We didn't see major differences based on race or ethnicity, although there was a slightly higher incidence of individuals who identify their race as white or Black in higher sequences, and also a slightly lower incidence of individuals in the Hispanic or Latino population. There were also a higher incidence of individuals from the metro area and males in higher sequences. Our group discussed here the probability that region confounds the race effect. People of color are more likely to live in metro areas where there's better access to transportation and services. We found that there are a lot of complexities and variables which made it difficult to discern the significance of the numbers we were seeing. Next, we looked at case duration. This is shown in days on the y-axis, and the average length of service for individuals in their first sequence is a little over 2 years and steadily declines with each sequence. The last point on the graph being about 6 months. So for each sequence, people are spending less time in services. And then we also looked at the gap between services, where we again see a steady decline. The gap between the first and second sequence was over just over 1,100 days, or roughly 3 years. Whereas the gap shown here between sequences 8 and 9 was right around 300 days, or roughly 10 months. And And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, John Yang, to describe more of the results and to wrap up the presentation.
Thanks, Carla. Please excuse me while I walk around. I'm kind of a pacer. So the next couple of slides is going to be fairly simple, but still very informative kind of cost-benefit analysis. So the outcomes we're looking at is the really short-term employment outcomes, right? Or short-term outcomes. And if you look across the case sequences, the success rate for our programs remains fairly steady. And in fact, over case sequences, there are some modest gains in terms of our success rate. So you see about a 9% increase as from sequence 2 to 6. And then after 6, there's a lot less observations, but it does seem like it's kind of trending down quite a lot. And so this slide is kind of showing us in terms of our impact in terms of this measure. It looks like we're doing pretty well consistently. Or mayhaps there's just no relationship between employment outcomes and case sequences here. So moving on to the next slide. So despite the fact that our outcomes are pretty steady and looking good, our inputs seem to be declining. So this slide is trying to explain that although we're kind of getting a good big bang per buck, basically saying that we are graduating people from our program with employment, but at the same time, it appears to be that we're investing fewer resources into these cases. So this is looking at purchase placement services, in particular, one of our performance-based agreements between our agency and our community partners. And basically, if our community partners are successful in finding employment for our participants, we issue a payment for them kind of as an incentive. And we look particularly into this specific type because it's kind of a proxy for a lot of different things aside from just monetary investments. The PBAs, the performance-based agreements, they proxy how many people are involved. Did they actually get to the CRP, the community partners stage? And once they meet up with community partners, was there enough work between the two bodies to create a placement plan in terms of how do we find employment? So there's a lot of activities also involved in this, not necessarily just financial. So this is kind of like a more encompassing proxy variable. It's not super specific, but it does give a general idea. And so it does look like our commitments and our investments don't necessarily sum up to as much as previous case sequences, which is says a couple things, right? So it does note that the nature of later sequences is different from the first few sequences, where first few sequences, people do interact a lot with one another. They do a lot of the formalities, and which is indicated by these incentive payments. But over time, it seems like the formalities are kind of lost over time, and that the case sequences are a little shorter, as we have seen, and a bit more informal in terms of let's brush off our resume and get back to that process, and it doesn't necessarily have to be as serious. So when we look at the overall views, it's really difficult to find significant differences between all these traits because there's a lot of confounding relationships between all these variables, but also at the same time, there's so much randomness in VR and what goes on during a case that it's, even with all the data that we collect, it's really hard to explain a lot of what's happening here. And so there's certainly a lot of limitations that we will talk about in the next slide. The sequences are getting shorter and people are coming back sooner. And it's unclear, again, since from the beginning, it's unclear if this is a good or bad thing. Is it good because they enjoy our services a lot and they trust our services and they are returning after each failure, or rather they don't like their employment, they come back because they believe in our services? Or at the same time, or rather on the other hand, is it because there is some sort of over-reliance, or is there some sort of other factor that is underlying all these the case progress, which we will talk a little bit in the next slide. So when we look at our employment outcomes, everything looks pretty stable until we look at the later sequences, kind of showing that in this metric of success, that it appears that we're doing all right. All right, so study limitations. Employment was measured right at exit, and it doesn't go out to second quarter employment as the RSA 911 does, and certainly does not look into things into fourth quarter and onwards. And so what this means is that there's kind of a lack, and all we can assume with these really short-term outcomes, it's hard to tell how durable this employment is. And so while we can measure kind of durability of work if we tag these participants over time, it's kind of hard to tell what type of jobs and the durability of those jobs when we only look at the immediate outcomes. Second, we looked at only 1 year cohort. We did this so that we can keep track of people, but expanding, and there's kind of a trade-off between the selectivity and trying to include as many people as possible. And in this case, since we're looking at so many case sequences, we do have to look quite a bit into the past, which has a lot of different temporal aspects to it. Back in 2005 is not necessarily the same economic environment as it is today. So in this case, we kind of try to adopt a sort of a longitudinal approach, but not exactly. It was kind of an incidental approach. So data availability was a little bit tricky for us because we did have to look really far back into the past, and there had been some sort of purging of data, and so we had to be creative in how we collected these data across multiple databases. But there's still kind of a gap between prior to about 2016, where data was reported in a slightly different way. Using a recent cohort, again, this kind of denotes that, if the time horizon in terms of our employment outcome measures is rather too short, and it's still hard to tell what the long-term returns to our services are. So this is still a really short-term analysis. And so we did use a lot of quantitative analysis, a lot of data analysis to be able to find evidence for some of these claims that our managers have anecdotally sent to us. And with this data, it's really interesting because we have talked to some of these managers and with leadership, and some of the data did align with these accounts, and some of them were very surprising, and it created a lot of conversation because, like the bang per buck argument that I presented earlier, was not really capturing the emotional cost for the counselor to be able to work with these frequent recurring customers. And so a qualitative approach would be more appropriate to look at these non-monetary and non-observable things. And I think that that would be our next step into our research. Right, so there are a number of ways. So in terms of our qualitative studies, first one is to look into our case notes library and to go into our cases and to read exactly what the interactions were like between the customer and the counselor. But even so, these case notes are somewhat sort of semi structured and formalized, and so it is still hard to grab at the very personal aspects of what may happen in the case. And so we do want to pay a careful attention to how people with hard of hearing or deaf and hard of hearing, what exactly is going on there, because that was quite a significant difference between the two groups, between low and high frequency customers. And a survey is one form of extension, in interviews, focus groups with managers and also with participants, which may be quite difficult, will probably give us a lot more information on how we reevaluate how we serve these participants and not necessarily pin all the weight on quantitative measures, and to highlight kind of the complexity the human interactions undoubtedly have that data will not necessarily be able to measure. All right, so that concludes our presentation. Next, we will be handing it off to Danielle Russell from the University of Wisconsin.
Okay. Okay, pull up my presentation here. Okay. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Danielle Russell, and I'm the Quality Assurance Analyst for the Wisconsin Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, or DVR. This is a new position in Wisconsin that was created in 2019. And in this role, I lead quality assurance efforts at DVR, including the statewide quality assurance team. And I'm a member of the Program Evaluation and Quality Assurance Advisory Committee. So research, evaluation, and data analysis skills are essential to my work, and I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to be a part of the PEQA Evaluation Studies Certificate Program. Before I start, I just want to thank Terry, Kate, and Aaron and the PEQA team at SVRI, Sue and the Capstone team, the leadership team at my organization at DVR, including my supervisor, Diana Kiesling, for supporting my participation in this program, and my capstone advisor, Dr. Kuo at Michigan State. Okay. So for my capstone project, I took a look at supported employment at DVR. As you likely know, Section 511 of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act requires vocational rehabilitation agencies to perform outreach to individuals who are already working in a sub-minimum wage environment. And WIOA also requires that youth aged 14 to 21 must receive vocational rehabilitation services prior to working for sub-minimum wage. So for these reasons, DVR needed to prepare for a possible increase in supported employment cases with the implementation of WIOA. And in addition, vocational rehabilitation counselors at DVR reported that supported employment consumers were returning to receive services after successful case closure. So we decided to review supported employment cases at DVR and find out if we needed to make any changes to how we provide supported employment. Supported employment means competitive integrated employment, including customized employment or employment in an integrated work setting in which an individual with the most significant disability, including a youth with the most significant disability, is working on a short-term basis toward competitive integrated employment that is individualized and customized, consistent with unique strengths, abilities, interests, and informed choice of the individual, including with ongoing support services for individuals with the most significant disabilities. And supported employment services can be provided to individuals with the most significant disabilities for whom competitive integrated employment has not historically occurred, or for whom competitive integrated employment has been interrupted or intermittent as a result of a significant disability, and who, because of the nature and severity of their disabilities, need intensive supported employment services and extended services after the transition from support provided by the designated state unit in order to perform this work. The basic steps in supported employment at DVR. Supported employment at DVR starts with an assessment to determine the consumer's need for supported employment. DVR and the consumer identify the consumer's supported employment team and explore long-term support options. Then DVR and the consumer and team develop the individualized plan for employment. The plan is implemented and revisited and amended as necessary. And DVR, the consumer, and the team plan for the consumer's transition to ongoing or long-term supports and case closure. So vocational rehabilitation counselors at DVR reported that supported employment consumers are returning to receive services after successful case closure. The goal of this project was to determine if the data supports this anecdotal evidence, and if so, to identify and compare trends in service delivery between non-return cases and return cases. The questions we were seeking to answer with this study were: how many supported employment consumers returned to DVR after successful case closure? And are there identifiable patterns in service delivery between non-return and return consumers that could indicate best practices for retention? The evaluation method for this project was a quantitative analysis using existing program data. Existing data was pulled from DVR's case management and data collection system, called IRIS, to identify returning consumers with a supported employment plan type. IRIS information included the consumer identifier and name, case status, demographics, eligibility and IPE information, disability type, total case expenditure, employment data, and relevant dates. And I obtained this data for calendar years 2014 to 2019. Pulling additional data elements like services provided from IRIS would have been time intensive and potentially costly. So I then merged the IRIS data I was able to obtain with RSA 911 data to form a more robust data set for analysis. While the data that I was able to get from IRIS was for the time period of 2014 to 2019, the RSA Excel datasets prior to July 1st, 2017 look very different to the datasets after that date, and the services profile changed as fewer services were tracked, and some services were tracked under a different label prior to July 1st, 2017. So for this reason, the IRIS dataset was revised to include only the initial cases closed between January 1st, 2014 and June 30th, 2017, and then merged with the RSA 911 data from the same time period. This means that the cases included in this data set were closed between January 1st, 2014 and June 30th, 2017, and cases were considered return cases if the consumer's return case was opened with a supported employment plan type by December 31st, 2019. My capstone advisor and I then performed a logistic regression analysis with SPSS. We included the data from the first case record of each return consumer's case and the non-return cases. We did this because we were trying to determine if there were differences in the initial cases that related to consumer return. So we left the return consumer's subsequent case records out of this analysis. Outcome in this model is defined as whether or not the consumer returned. So all of the consumer cases in this model were closed as successful. And And while gender, race, and ethnicity were not found by SPSS to be significantly correlated to outcome in this study, it is worth mentioning that the sample was not notably diverse. So you can see that we have 29.69% white females in the sample and 52% white males in the sample. So out of the total 741 cases in this data set, 192 returned to DVR for further services prior to January 1st, 2020, and 549 did not return prior to that date. So in other words, just shy of 26% of supported employment consumers returned to VR after a successful closure. Of the employment characteristics, hourly wage was identified by SPSS as significantly associated with outcome, meaning whether or not the consumer returned, but hours worked per week was not. Consumers who did not return after a successful closure earned a higher hourly wage on average. And you'll also notice that the average number of days from employment to case closure is higher for non-return consumers than for return consumers. And we'll talk more about that later in the presentation. Occupation, which was looked at by ONET code, was not found to be related to outcome in this model. This was a really interesting find. This is the rate of return by WDA, which stands for Workforce Development Area, the area of the state where the consumers received services. The two areas of the state where the lowest percentage of consumers returned are WDA2 and WDA7. It's interesting because these areas could not be more different. WDA2 is the Milwaukee area near the southeast corner of the state. It's home to Wisconsin's most populous city, and it's an urban area. WDA7, by contrast, contains the northernmost county in the state, and it's a rural area with a relatively low population density. And we'll come back to this later in the presentation when we talk about implications for future research. One area we really wanted to focus on during this project was the services the consumers received. We thought there might be differences in the services provided to those who returned versus to those who did not. And to understand how the services provided related to the outcome, we used two models in SPSS. We did this because findings regarding the relationship between services provided and outcome differed based on the consumer's primary and secondary impairments. And first, we'll look at the results when the logistic regression was performed in SPSS with only those cases where the primary or secondary impairment was entered as code 17, which is cognitive impairments. In this model, the sample was reduced from 741 cases to 598. And of the 598 cases in the sample, 158 returned to DVR for further services. So 26.42% of supported employment consumers with cognitive impairments returned to vocational rehabilitation after successful closure. We also found that the logistic regression model was a good fit for this data with a coefficient of determination of 0.285. Of the demographic data in this model, only age was found to be significantly related to outcome. There were no significant differences between the two groups, the return and non-return consumers, in ethnicity, race, or gender. And you will notice here the age of consumer at application data. There's a lower percentage of return consumers with younger ages. And then it's just around the mid 40s, so 42 through 45, you see the gap kind of closes in. There was a higher percentage of return. Okay, in this model, one service, job readiness training, was found to be significantly correlated to outcome. A second service, job search assistance, was found to be borderline significantly related to outcome. And you'll notice that job readiness training was provided at a higher rate to those consumers who would go on to return versus to those who would not return. When the logistic regression was performed in SPSS with only those cases where the primary or secondary impairment was code 18, psychosocial impairments, the sample was reduced from 741 cases to 328. And of the 328 cases in the sample, 94 returned to DVR for further services and 234 did not return. So 28.66% of supported employment consumers with psychosocial impairments returned to VR after a successful closure. The logistic regression model again was a good fit for this data with a coefficient of determination of 0.535. In this model, there were no significant differences between the two groups in age, ethnicity, race, or gender. 4 services were found to be significantly related to outcome. The first 2 were assessment and on-the-job training. Both of these services were provided at a higher rate to the consumers who would go on to return. Disability-related skills training and information and referral services were also found to be significantly related to outcome and were also provided at a higher rate to return consumers. And 2 additional services were found to be borderline significantly related to outcome: rehabilitation technology and job search assistance. You may remember that job search assistance was also identified as borderline significant in the model using the cognitive impairment sample. A review of previous research did not reveal a baseline statistic for the rate of supported employment consumer return after successful closure and supported employment. So the findings regarding consumer rates of return are significant as baseline data for DVR, and DVR can now use this to help determine the effectiveness of changes to how we provide supported employment based on improvements in the outcome of return versus non-return. That the consumers who returned to DVR had on average a lower number of days between employment and case closure indicates that we may be closing cases too early and reinforces the importance of ensuring stability on the job before case closure. The link between hourly wage and outcome is not altogether surprising. And as recent legislation intends to direct VR consumers away from subminimum wage work and into competitive integrated employment, VR counselors and agency partners are working to assist consumers with finding and maintaining employment at competitive wages. And while age at application was significant in the cognitive impairments model, this is not necessarily an actionable finding. The data may give VR counselors an indication that a supported employment consumer they're working with is more likely to return after a successful closure, but there's no specific action for them to take based on this information. Another factor to consider is that just of the 741 cases in the sample, customized employment services were only provided in 4. And this indicates that customized employment was a seriously underutilized service at DVR. Customized employment is an effective option when typical supported employment strategies have not been successful, or when customized employment strategies may more successfully meet a consumer's individualized support needs. And while the rate of use was low in these cases closed prior to July 1st, 2017, DVR did recognize early on that there were low rates for this service, and training has since been provided for DVR staff and service providers on customized employment. That the services that were significantly linked to outcome differed between the model of cases with primary or secondary cognitive impairments, where just one service was identified as significantly related to outcome, and the model of cases with primary or secondary psychosocial impairments, where multiple services were found to be significantly related to outcome, also tells us something about supported employment at DVR. So combined with the finding that a higher percentage of consumers with psychosocial impairments returned to DVR after successful case closure, and that all of the services found to be significantly linked to outcome were provided at a higher rate to those consumers who would go on to return than to those who would not, this could be an indication that VR counselors are not as knowledgeable about serving consumers with mental illness diagnoses as those with cognitive impairments. And it suggests that DVR counselors need additional disability-specific training to be able to successfully serve consumers with psychosocial impairments. and training is currently in the works for DVR staff on mental illness and employment. I think it's also important to note, though, that we would expect to see slightly higher rates of return among consumers with mental illness diagnoses due to the chronic and episodic nature of mental illness. Some consumers may do very well for a period of time, and proper supports and services may prolong successful periods, but there may be an episode where a consumer needs to return for additional supports. And there are also limitations to the method and the data which should be noted. Firstly, this method only provides information regarding one part of the process, which is the VR counselor working with the consumer and their supported employment team to identify and implement services to assist the consumer in achieving the job goal. A more comprehensive review of supported employment still needs to be conducted, which considers all inputs, including service providers and other partners that can affect outcomes. When I started the PEQA program in pre-COVID times, the intent was to complete a mixed method study of supported employment, where the information learned from a quantitative analysis would be used to inform the design of a focus group. However, because of changes in my work situation due to the pandemic, I had to postpone the focus group portion of this study. Secondly, I was not able to single out IPS cases in this data set. So the IRIS case management system distinguishes between IPS and other supported employment, but the RSA 911 data that I had did not. And that was the data that I had to obtain for services provided. However, customized employment was a data element in the RSA 911 data set, so I was able to see when customized employment services were provided. It is also possible that there exist coding errors in consumer case records that affect the data. For example, some of the cases in the sample might truly have included customized employment services, but as the service is not as well understood and as staff are more comfortable with supported employment, customized employment services might be coded as other supported employment services. And there's also potential for data error in coding impairments at eligibility, including code 18, psychosocial impairments, and code 19, other mental impairments. I don't believe we have a lot of definition for these for VR counselors to use when coding impairments at eligibility, and code 19 may be used as a catch-all when a counselor is not sure which code is most appropriate. Another limitation is that there was no quantitative data available regarding the reason for return. One of the recommendations that I have for DVR as a result of this project is to add a field in our case management system, IRIS, to collect information for returning consumers. The results of the quantitative study can be used to inform a qualitative study at DVR, and the rate of return by workforce development area, I think, would be especially interesting to explore and determine if there are partnerships or processes in areas with low rates of return that may account for better retention. The baseline data that was gathered can be used to help evaluate the effectiveness of changes at DVR. And more research is needed to understand why outcomes differ between consumers with cognitive and psychosocial impairments. A quality assurance review may also help to determine if counselors are in fact having difficulty with coding at eligibility. We want to make sure that our data is accurate, but more importantly, we want to make sure we're serving our consumers to the best of our abilities. And this concludes my presentation. I'll turn it back over to Erin for wrap up and Q&A. Thanks everyone for attending today.
Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining us. These studies were very, very interesting. I appreciate all of the information that you all shared. I encourage anyone who's interested in asking questions to feel welcome to post them in the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen. I have some questions for all participants that I would like to begin with Kevin. So Kevin, I'll give you a second just to unmute. I have a couple questions. First off, did you encounter any challenges with getting reliable data related to your study?
No, not at all. I mean, I was just looking at, our RSA 911 tables, and Mathematic had already prepared some extract tables for this sort of purpose. By the way, since I am unmuted right now, there are plumbers in my building, and there's a lot of drilling going on. So
Perfect. Not a problem. I just have two more questions to
ask me the question. They were like making a lot of noise, so I don't know what's going to happen here.
I love it. No
Yep,
worries.
now.
Okay, so then with that in mind, then, as we kind of evade the plumbers, what changes were made within your agency based on the data and dashboard in your study?
Well, we don't have a dashboard yet, and and in terms of changes made, honestly, nothing so far. This really was just all wrapped up in the last few months.
Okay, do you foresee any changes?
I'm an underachiever, in other words. Do I foresee any changes? I said
Yes.
I'm an underachiever, in other words. Do I foresee any
No,
changes?
not at all.
Yes, yes. I hope to, yeah. I would like to do a much more detailed breakdown in terms of some of the factors we already covered in this. And yes, and I'm going to do a presentation probably soon before some of the key staff on all this to see what we can do to like start addressing some of these concerns, particularly where we're losing consumers.
Wonderful. And then the last question is, what have regional offices done in their service area to resolve the glitches or issues found, which I kind of think, based on what you just said, might be forthcoming?
Yeah, too soon, but we have identified definitely some, areas where we're strong and some areas where we're very weak. And I honestly, I think that at least some of the managers there are probably aware of this already, but yes.
Very good. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it very much. Next, I have some questions for our team Minnesota. And I'll give you all three a chance to unmute. You guys are welcome to answer this however you can do, rock, paper, scissors, or however. But the questions I have for you are, were there any differences in the clients or parts of the state on sequences of employment outcomes?
Sorry, I couldn't hear. Could you say that again?
Yeah, it says, were there differences in clients or parts of the state on sequences on employment outcomes? And what are you looking at next?
So it was briefly mentioned that there were higher sequences correlated to metro areas. And this had to do with a number of factors, most notably transportation. It takes a lot more resources like automobiles to, in more rural areas to get to our workforce centers. On the other hand, metro areas will definitely have more mobility in order to get to where you need to go.
And as a result of your study, what changes have been made or are you planning to make within your agency within the state?
I will say that the results of our study were surprising in that we found very little differences in the higher sequences versus the low sequences, and that didn't match our expectations. It didn't match necessarily some of the stories, the information that we gathered from people. And so we haven't made any changes because really we didn't find what we expected to.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much, Team Minnesota. I have some questions now for Danielle. The first two questions actually I have is, what was the median and mode for the time span between successful closure and return for the consumer?
That information I don't have readily available, just because that's a little bit outside of the scope of what I looked at, since we did focus on their initial cases, and rather than focusing on the time between when they exited and when they returned. So we really just looked at those first cases as successful closed cases.
Okay, and was there an assessment related to SE service providers on outcome of maintenance or maintaining employment? I'm sorry. So was there an assessment related to SE service provider on outcome of maintaining employment?
Nope. So that was that's something that I discussed during the limitations, and because the data that we had really just focuses on that one piece of supported employment, the counselor and the consumer and team working together to determine the appropriate services and provide those services. I think as far as monitoring the service provider quality or the quality of those services provided from the service provider perspective, that is something that I think a different study, a qualitative study a focus group could get at. We also have a service provider performance and quality group work group at DVR that is working on a tool to review service provider quality of services right now, but that has not yet been implemented.
Perfect. What are the strategies that Wisconsin may consider to implement or pursue based upon your research?
Well, a few of the recommendations that I have that I would like to see are more information about returning consumers in the supported employment guidance piece that we have for our voc rehab counselors. And I would like to see that contain more information about when to consider customized employment and update that guidance piece with more information about how to code the different supported employment services. I would also like to see a field in our case management system that will collect information on returning consumers. I'm on that work group that is working to evaluate service provider quality now. So that is something that is ongoing. And I would like to see more training on mental health for VR counselors. And that is something that is also upcoming.
Perfect. Another question is, was long-term follow-up along service a factor in your study?
Was long-term follow-up a factor in my study? Because I just looked at those initial cases to see if there were differences between their initial cases. No, it was not.
Okay. And will you continue to pursue additional research related to this study, specifically following up with focus groups as you'd originally planned, or will you continue to move on to other areas of study?
I would like to do that. So that did have to be postponed when the pandemic hit. But that is something that I will bring up to the Program Evaluation and Quality Assurance Advisory Committee. That's where we sort of decide where these activities will go, because there are also other priorities for quality assurance at this time as well.
Perfect. And then two little quick ones. What are the most important factors in rates of return? And I apologize if I'm asking some of these out of order, but what are the most important factors in rates of return for your study?
The most significant that was found by SPSS was actually information and referral services. That was the most significant factor related to outcome for consumers with psychosocial impairments. And so that may be referring consumers for county mental health services or housing assistance. That was the most significant by far. Another one that I think is significant to look at, even though it was only found to be borderline significant by SPSS, was job search assistance, because that service was found to be significant across the board.
Fantastic. And were your results a surprise to counselors and managers? Did you find it? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I don't necessarily think that they're very surprising, only because, counselors did report that consumers were returning. So it was not a surprise to find out that they were returning. Counselors have been asking for mental health diagnoses training. So that is something that we're aware of is needed. And it's not necessarily surprising to find out that consumers with mental health diagnoses would be returning at a higher rate just because of the nature of mental health diagnoses.
Fantastic, Danielle. Thank you very much for your time. I'm going to pass this over to Kate.
Great. Thank you, Erin. Well, again, thank you to all of our panelists. Excellent presentations today. I always learn so much with and from you, and really appreciate the time and commitment that you made to PEQA and following through with your projects. So special thanks to Kevin, Carrie, Carla, John, and Danielle, and congratulations on successfully graduating from the PEQA program. The presentations today have been recorded, and the PEQA team will be ensuring that the captioning and whatnot is completed to enhance accessibility if you would like to access these recordings at a later date. And we are actively working to move the capstone information into the Capstone Hub on the PEQA website, the project website, which is peqatac.org. and .com will get you there too. With that, again, thank you to RSA for your continued support for this project. We appreciate it. Thank you and congratulations to all our panelists. Thank you to the PEQA team and to you, our viewers. We appreciate you making the time in your busy days to join us. And with that, we will sign off and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.